Bible. What is it comprised of? The Old Testament, a Christian term, is comprised of 39 books, and they're divided into sections. 5 books of Moses, quite a bit of history, and lots of law. Lots of law. This is followed by 12 historical books. The history runs over the several hundred years during the occupation of the land of Israel and the exile to Babylon. 5 books on wisdom and reflection, some verses of which have been turned into rock music, follows an ironic twist, some might venture. 5 more from what we call the major prophets, bigger books in the remaining 12, whom Christians call the minor prophets. And this gives us what most Protestants are familiar with when they look at their Old Testament. Where did this Old Testament come from? From the Jewish Bible, actually, put together by men of the Great Assembly over 100 years from 410 to 310 BC. As we all know, they call the first 5 the Torah. Their next section is the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and here the rules and the order starts to change. No minor or major prophets with them. The Jews believe there were 1 million prophets between Moses and the formation of the Bible, or the Tanakh. Only the very best got in there. There follows the Ketuvim, or the writings. The Jews actually combined some of their books, so their total is only 24 books, and it is not the Old Testament to them, it is their Bible. So already we have a different order, a different approach, and the Jews open their Bible from the back. Takes a bit of getting used to. Not finished with the Old Testament yet. The 2 major oldest Christian denominations, the Orthodox, sometimes referred to as Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, or Eastern Orthodox, depending on who is talking or which region they refer to, and the Roman Catholic Church. The Orthodox include a whole bunch of other books. Their Bible looks something like this. The names of some of the books might alter, like Sirach might be called Ecclesiasticus, and the book of Esdras is the book of Ezra with 99 extra verses. And again, depending on which branch of the Orthodox Church you're referring to, the list might look slightly different. The broadest collection might include the 2nd and 3rd book of Esdras, Psalm 151, the Prayer of Manasseh, and the 3rd book of Maccabees. Their Old Testament is very similar to the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholic Bible doesn't have that last bunch that the Orthodox might, however. Many people know these extra books as the Apocrypha, so already we have different versions of the Bible, at least the Old Testament, across the 3 major sections of the Christian faith. What about the New Testament? We start with the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then move on to only one historical book, the Acts of the Apostles. Then there is a group of 13 letters written by Paul, who has more books in the Bible ascribed to him than any other one person. These are followed by 8 letters written by other authors, and finally there is one apocalyptic book called the Revelation of John. All major sections of the faith share this list. Martin Luther, who put a serious stamp on Christendom and had a strong personality to boot, he felt Hebrews, James, Jude and Revelation were questionable, so he put them at the end of his Lutheran New Testament. Questionable? Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation? That's big. Was he the only one to dispute books? You can probably guess. There are lots of books that didn't make it into the Old Testament. Here are a few of them. If you want to read a real thriller, download the Book of Jasher. It just appeared a few hundred years back, and nobody can prove where it came from, but seriously entertaining, and a Book of Jasher is actually referred to twice in the Bible. Come to the New Testament, and there are still more. There are at least 10 Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. 10! There are also plenty of letters that aren't included, plus historical books, plus apocalyptic books. We've only included a sample here of the many books and letters that were disputed. You want to know the age-old question? Who decided what went in the New Testament? Opinions are many and vary widely. Comical cynics say the Emperor Constantine threw them all at a table. Those that landed on the table got included. Those that fell on the floor didn't get in. More spiritual people would say that godly men were guided in discussions and reflections as to inclusion. The truth is, there was no one body or committee or council that actually voted on this. There were many opinions and differing views. What we have is what we have. In the 20th century, there was an explosion of Bible versions written. English ones, I mean. We're not even looking at other language translations. All of the English ones claim authenticity. Well, who wouldn't? I mean, who would translate a Bible and then confess someone else's was better? This graph is an interesting one. It looks at 20 different versions and ranks them on a scale between accurate translation of each word and accurate translation of each thought. So on the right we have more correct by thought, and on the left more correct by word. Now we can put warm fuzzies around this if we like, but the major conclusion we must draw is that at least 20 organisations went to all this effort because they felt other translations were questionable in the way they had interpreted the ancient Hebrew and Greek versions of the Bible. Time to write a few notes on the whiteboard, that marvellous blame-storming device. Actually, we're not going to do that. Far from it. In fact, now is a good time to put in the disclaimer. We're not here to say who is wrong or right. We are merely listing questions. Let me say it again. You can argue the right or wrong of many of the questions we're listing here, but you can't question that they are questions. So if we found the Bible is, one, it's got different versions. Many books are disputed. Thirdly, many books were rejected. And we have a serious number of translations today, so somebody must be disagreeing about translations. Themes of the Bible. What is the Bible all about anyway? Surely there is some agreement here. The Jewish. Let's start with the Jews, and this theme is by no means the only one they have. It is one amongst many. The Jews only have the Old Testament, as Christians call it. That starts big with God. He does serious moves, like creating the world. Then God goes on to create light and darkness, flora and fauna, not to mention man and woman. But then God's acts get progressively lighter. He assists with the Exodus, helps the Israelites win battles, but it is smaller than like creating the world or a human being. The last historical book in the Jewish Bible is Esther. By then the Jews are in captivity in Babylon. God is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther, not once. God has almost absented himself. This has prompted scholars to paint a grand theme about the Jewish Bible. It is both the withdrawal of God and the emergence of man. In Esther it is men and women who together figure out solutions to their problems. Some fasting thrown in, but not even prayer. Evangelical, one Protestant evangelical theme is that the entire Bible, every single book, points to the revelation of Jesus Christ and his redemptive sacrifice for the sins of the world. This view is a strongly unitary view, and it is backed up by lots of prophecies in the Old Testament that appear to come true in the New Testament, i.e. Jesus is predicted right from the start. The prophetic or apocalyptic. This view holds that the Bible speaks of the past, the present and the future. It doesn't matter which age you live in, this has and will always be true. The writer of Ecclesiastes tells us there is nothing new under the sun, and it is a reasonable approach. Of course, you could say Moses didn't have a Honda, but in terms of human emotions and spiritual realities, the apocalyptic view is valid. Pastoral. You may have heard the phrase, the Bible is the Creator's manual. If you want to run your life successfully, read it. And many pastors today spend a serious amount of time simply teaching people how to get by day to day. Budgeting, finance, jobs, children, marriage. Advice on these things can be ascertained from the scriptures. Fair enough too. Now, the interesting thing about this particular page is that very few people mind you coming out with multiple themes. Most of you probably think this is okay. Maybe not the Jewish one. If you've never heard of the Jewish one and it annoys you, at the very least you're likely to think about it some more. However, let's just remember, there are multiple themes. Well, who wrote the Bible? Let's start with the Old Testament. Many, perhaps a majority of followers, believe that God spoke, and those who heard him wrote down the words to pass on to us. This is certainly how the 5 books of Moses, or Torah, are presented to many churchgoers, and it is a strong argument. Like this is the first time in recorded history that a single, invisible God communicated any message to anyone, let alone a message that had love and mercy tied up in it. So Moses wrote down what was said to him. Of course, yes, it's a little difficult that Moses wrote about his own death or referred to himself as the most humble man on earth. Moses-friendly scholars might say, okay, well, he had scribes that he dictated to. That's reasonable as well. We do know Moses learned how to delegate from his father-in-law. Linguistic scholars have examined the books of Moses, however, and discovered textual differences between various sections. They claim that those 5 books of Moses are actually a composite of half a dozen sources stitched together. This is called the documentary hypothesis, and it is fundamentally a serious cut and paste exercise. Don't mock it. If you read the documentary hypothesis, it is a very powerful argument. Many noted writers, in fact, think it was Ezra who put it together. But Jews and many Christians have trouble with the documentary hypothesis. The Jews in particular, who place great emphasis on God speaking or God's word, can't go along with it. The Jewish philosopher Spinoza got into either deep trouble or wide publicity, whichever view you prefer, publicising the Ezra authorship. And let's not forget poor young Aikenhead on the Edinburgh gallows, accused of the same belief. What about the New Testament? Let's look at the timeline. Jesus was born at the beginning of the Common Era. Interesting digression, but we are now politically correct. We used to say BC for before Christ, but we now say BCE for before Common Era. Anyway, Jesus was born 0 AD, plus or minus a year or 4, so he died in the early 30s AD. Much recent scholarship places the Gospel of Matthew at the end of the 1st century, say in the late 80s or 90s. That would make Matthew a very old man by the time he wrote that Gospel. Therefore, it may not even have been him. Many experts surmise he didn't write it, but it was given his name to legitimise it with the Church. Recent papyrus finds, however, have dated a fragment of the Gospel of Matthew, either 66 AD or earlier. This would mean that the actual Matthew referred to as a disciple of Jesus could well have been the author. I'm only using this as an example to say that dating of manuscripts is difficult and questions exist over who actually wrote the Gospels. What about Paul, the author of those 13 letters? Well, he didn't even write the first one. Now, Tertius could well have been a secretary to whom Paul dictated. There is a very good argument for that. What about the other letters? Paul is very specific about how he wrote letters, purposefully putting in a line like this one from 2 Thessalonians. This is how I write, my distinguishing mark. Okay, but what about the letters he is supposed to have written where that line is absent? In those days it was commonplace to ascribe the writing of a letter to someone more famous than yourself. It was not the copyright infringement deal that it is today. Let's move on. Versification. Did you think the Bible came out neatly lined up with chapters and verses? Wrong. These convenient divisions were organised starting in the year 1227 AD. Now, the guys who did it were good and tried their best. They took a page and inserted a verse structure so us, the readers, could readily find our way around the Bible. In fact, versification proved so popular, even the Jews took it on and introduced the same system into their Bible. But those verse and chapter headings can somewhat change the flow of thought or argument the Bible is getting across. The most common trap for young players is where a chapter starts with the word therefore. People tend to read as if it is looking forward into the chapter, whereas mostly a therefore is carrying on a line of thought started in the previous chapter. Many different interpretations arise based on this simple issue. And finally, here we are at the controversy section. You ready? Here's a simple one to ease us into it. Numbers. There are plenty of references to huge slaughters of people, large numbers falling in battles. Here is 20,000 men falling in one day to King David's army. Let's put that into perspective. The American War of Independence lasted 7 years and 25,000 died, most of those from disease, perhaps only 10,000 in battle over 7 years. It is only in the last couple of centuries that we have experienced mass deaths. Given the archaeological estimates of population size, the disorganised battles and the lack of firearms, it is stretching to think that perhaps 10 to 50% of the entire population died in a single day. Slurs against various people or genders or races or ages. Let me pick a relatively innocuous one to illustrate the point. Hope there's nobody from Crete listening. Now again, some scholars can explain these all away, and they might be right. We're merely pointing out documented controversies. Historical inaccuracies. I'm only going to give you one as an example. Here's a well-known one from a famous speech in the book of Acts. Gamaliel is warning the Jews not to persecute the Christians too much, and he brings to mind previous rebels who came to naught. He reminds us of Theudas' revolt, and there was a documented revolt by Theudas. Problem is, it happened after Gamaliel died. Now, some Bible scholars say, Luke is referring to another Theudas that we don't know about, or that Theudas was a common name, etc. Well, the revolt by the historically recorded Theudas occurred after Gamaliel died. I'm not telling you what is correct, just relaying the questions. Inconsistencies. And this particular one is only a little one. King Josiah gets a nice prophecy that he'll go down to his grave in peace. Next few verses, he is out getting slain in battle. Oh, that was his choice, you say. You mean you can choose your way past a prophecy from God? Let's park that one for a while. Let me say it one more time. The point is not what your stand is on these controversies. The point is undeniably that they exist. If you haven't heard of any of them, just type a few phrases into Google and you'll find out. And mentioning Google, here is a major rub. Even if you heard of those biblical contradictions 20 years ago, how would you check them out? Back then, a young person asking such questions could probably be silenced by pressure talk from a well-meaning pastor. Not today. Biblically critical tales become blockbuster movies. Da Vinci Code type novels are an industry, and the internet is sitting there waiting. If you type biblical contradictions into Google, you get thousands of hits back. Anything you like can immediately be searched on or found. Knowledge availability means at least one important thing, so far as our topic is concerned, and it is this. We used to hear admonitions from the pulpit about the believers in the Berea and the Acts of the Apostles who went home and examined the Scripture to see if what Paul said was true. If you have young, inquiring minds in your congregation, you better bet your boots they can and will search the electronic world. Whiteboard time again. Let's add in some more questions. Many different themes, some you may not like. Questions on authorship, on who wrote it, versification, some potential interpretation issues there, and controversial topics of various degrees. And there's still a little space left on the whiteboard. Now let's look at the effect of these questions over the centuries. I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge perhaps people do have questions over the Bible. How has that manifested itself? Have these questions led anywhere in the past? Let's do a quick historical look through doctrine, decree, and dogma. As the early church got underway, they convened many councils to sort things out and get consistency in belief. In other words, because certain things weren't clear, they got together to try and come to an agreement on questions, to get an agreed set of standards of what people should believe. There were lots of these, and the most famous are probably the Nicene councils. There were also ecumenical councils back then, and others named after the city they were convened in, which brings us to Constantinople, where the centre of the Eastern Roman Empire established itself. In the year 1054 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Eastern Church split from the Western Church. It was a very big deal, and purportedly over the inclusion of the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, which is still read in many, many churches to this day. Historians, of course, claim the schism was due to power politics. That's not for me to say, nor have we time to explain the theological debates over the Filioque clause. Look it up on Wikipedia and come to your own conclusions. Anyway, if that wasn't bad enough, the Western Roman Catholic Church declined morally by its own later ascent, and when Martin Luther appeared, he had enough support to draw away most of Northern Europe into the Protestant Church. Luther had theological reasons as well as moral reasons for separating from Rome, which is still disputed over today. Rome incidentally cleaned up its act in the Counter-Reformation, but that did not lead to a reunification with the Protestants. Now let's look at the split chart. Since the days of the early church, movements have broken away into a bewildering array of options. While 1054 was the first big split, today a church split wouldn't rank a mention in your local newspaper. We almost expect it. And all of them, even Protestants, claim they have the strongest link to the early church movement. All the major sections of the faith claim this. Let's look now at today's scenario in a single country. This map of the USA reflects the dominant religion or denomination by county. We're not looking into the details so much here, just the overall patchwork quilt of differing denominations. This map actually doesn't tell the full story. Drill down a layer or two and you will uncover in excess of 6,000 separate denominations in the USA alone. Worldwide, this figure extends to between 22,000 and 33,000 distinct denominations in 238 countries. Final go at the whiteboard. Doctrine, decree, dogma, plenty of that, leading eventually to the great schism of 1054 AD. Martin Luther nails his thesis to the Wittenberg door, and Protestantism ensues. Today we have thousands of versions of Christianity around the world. True, many have overlapping and similar beliefs, but no matter what your pastor or priest or vicar says, they must have differences somewhere, or there wouldn't be in different organisations. This is what the world sees. Don't fool yourself otherwise.